Hi, everyone. My name is Mina Jane. I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library, and I'm so thrilled that you are here for this amazing program that is all about voting. We had decided with the League of Women Voters to celebrate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage this year, which is, we got the right to vote in August. And so we're really excited about having the right to vote, of course, but we also want to know more about it. So Rachael Cobb is here to talk about voting turnout and the things that affect it. And so we're happy to have her here. I wanted to thank the League of Women Voters for helping us bring this program to you, as well as the Cary Library Foundation, which supports all of our adult programming. So with that, I'm going to turn it, oh wait, I'm supposed to introduce her. Rachael Cobb is the chair and associate professor of government at Suffolk University, where my daughter goes to college, by the way. But that had nothing to do with the decision about asking her to do this. She specializes in U.S. elections, election administration, electoral politics, civic engagement, and political participation. So I feel like she's like the perfect person to talk about this. So I'm going to hand it over to her, and she can tell you more about herself and what she's going to be talking about today.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Rachael Cobb. I chair the Department of Political Science and Legal Studies at Suffolk University. And I am here today not to talk about women's right to vote, although that is something that I'm happy to discuss further, but just broadly what we can expect or what we know about voter turnout and who votes and why that is the case. And then look a little bit about what are the mobilization techniques that are going to be most effective. We know what's most effective in normal years. I think this is going to be a particularly challenging year for voter mobilization. And I am thinking about how to vote safely quite a bit. So I'm in the time that we have after I make my presentation, I'm happy to talk about those issues if that's of interest. I also want to just say that I will be, I welcome questions and I will be monitoring the chat. Please feel free to ask questions as we move along, and I might be briefly distracted reading it, but I will try to answer as many questions as I possibly can. And my thinking is that I'll talk for about 15 to 20 minutes and then we can have a discussion. So I want to begin by talking about the demographics of who votes in this country, in the United States. And there are people who vote more, and those people are the affluent people in the United States, people with high levels of education, and older voters. The people who vote less are people who are essentially this in reverse. So who are less affluent, who have low levels of education, and who are young. Those are the primary descriptors, not drivers, of the demographic puzzle that we actually continue to study in political science because we're still figuring out why this is the case. And I think all of us have very probably good, solid, reasonable, and accurate thinking about why this is the case, but it is also a puzzle. So just to show you, if we look at income over time, and I'm going to move my screen a little bit just so I can see here. If we look at income over time and who votes and the turnout, you can see that the top quintile votes at the very highest rate and that the lowest quintile votes at probably the lowest rate. And that has, even though ebbed and flowed, it has stayed fairly stable over time. When we voting age by education, the citizen voting age population and turnout rates by education, the blue line at the bottom is those who have received the least amount of education, and the purple line at the top is those with the most. And we see again that in presidential election years, people vote who have the most amount of education vote at the highest rates, up in the upwards of 80 to 90%. and those with the lowest levels of education vote at the lowest rates. And this trend is the same pretty much by age as well. And in general, we see that people who have the highest ages are also voting at the highest rates. And by race and ethnicity. Now this one is a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk about that as we move along. But you can see the blue line is the non-Hispanic white population, and the non-Hispanic Black population are voting at what are emerging to be, as time goes on from the 80s through the 2000s, to be at a similar rate, and then Hispanic and other populations are voting at different rates. Although a lot is changing in this country vis-a-vis race, and it has happened, this massive demographic shift that has happened since the 80s. I'm sorry, since the 70s. One of the things that people often ask is whether non-voters and voters are the same or different. And so this slide addresses the issue of the political attitude of people who are non-voters versus voters. So let's just start at the very top. We look at the party identification, Democrats, Independents, Republicans, and others. And when we look at the percentage of non-voters who identify as Democrats versus the percentage of voters that identify as Democrats, it is higher among those who are voters. Among independents, it is lower, and among Republicans, it is higher. The main takeaway from this is that party affiliation is identity that helps to drive mobilization and helps to drive people to be voters. So if people are loosely affiliated or not affiliated as they are as independents, then their feelings of alienation from the political process tends to be greater. When we look at ideology, we can see that among liberals, it's actually pretty much the same between those who identify as liberal, between voters and voters, roughly the same. Among moderates, it's a little bit different, and among conservatives, it's quite a bit different. So the things that drive turnout are the twin issues of mobilization and membership organizations and social movements. I'll begin with social movements right now because in the context of the turmoil and the passion that this country is engaged in at this very moment, and the kinds of social mobilization that we're seeing around Black Lives Matter and around protesting in the United States, that is actually an indicator that the level of engagement with the political process is extremely high. And we would imagine that people who are now going who are now engaged in those kinds of efforts are most likely going to begin to engage in the political process. And when I say begin, for those who haven't, this is a politicizing moment. And so this is an opportunity for much greater political engagement than we've seen in the past. And this is something that we've seen traditionally. That the other thing, so this is not something that I had planned in a slide, but I will say something that I've been thinking about, and we could perhaps discuss what everyone thinks about this. One of the things, there's an author and historian at Harvard, Alexander Keesar, who wrote a very important book called The Right to Vote. And one of the things that he points out is that the moments historically when we see the expansion of the franchise are the moments when the country comes to grips with some kind of understanding of the historic wrongs. So for example, the expansion of the franchise to African American men followed the Civil War. the expansion of the franchise for women followed World War I. The expansion of the franchise to 18-year-olds followed the Vietnam War, or came along with the Vietnam War, but the expansion coupled with the draft. And the desegregation of the armed forces following World War II. So war, and also, I should say, gays in the military following the Iraq War. So war seems to have a massive impact on the country reflecting back on what its democratic ideals are and then doing something about it. And I've been wondering whether this moment is a moment of expansion because of the nation coming to grips with its with the racism in this country right now. So membership organizations such as unions, the National Rifle Association, the National Organization for Women, the ACLU. Excuse me.
Where's the pink iPad?
It is somewhere on the floor.
I don't see it anywhere.
Okay. Dashel, I'm gonna.
Dashel's being with me.
Excuse me. Sorry about that. So membership organizations play a large role in mobilizing their members. So people who are feeling alienated from the political process or who are not contacted by social groups are also less likely to vote. And in part, that is a mechanism that organizations use as a method of exclusion, mobilizing their own members, obviously, but not mobilizing the broader group. When we look at elections, I always think it's important to not just focus our efforts on presidential elections, but to understand elections more broadly. So we want to look at things such as the type of election, whether it's a local, state, or federal election, the competitiveness of the election, policies that exist at the state and local level, such as voter identification, felon disenfranchisement, other kinds of rules that structure the political system, and then the things that we've already touched on: income, educational attainment, age, and ethnicity. So one of the things that we've also seen over the past time is what happens in cities, for example. So the average voter turnout in municipal elections has essentially gone from being in the range of 26%, about a quarter, down to 20%. And that is a drop that is significant. So that is a puzzle. Why has voter turnout in cities declined so much over the last 10 years? And here is an examination of voter turnout declines in the largest cities between 1952 and 2012. And since there's a lot of text here, I'll just walk you through it. We see at the very beginning of when we look at 1950, and this goes all the way up to 2012, and I'll just be sure that we're clear that the blue line, we're tracking Chicago, the black line, we're tracking New York, and the red line, Philadelphia, the gray line, Los Angeles. And this, what I think is important here is to see the kinds of voter participation that we saw in municipal elections in the 50s and the 60s that then went so far down by the time we get to 2012 that we are seeing a percentage, for example, in New York that goes from above 90% all the way down to 20%. And this is not just a demographic story. It's not just an income story. It's not just an ethnicity story or an age story or an education story. It's a story about the mobilization techniques that politicians are using, and it's a story about the kinds of engagement that is happening at the local level that has declined so significantly. And that has spillover effects to national elections as well, although we certainly have not seen this kind of decline at the presidential level. So what is it about municipal engagement that we are not seeing at that is so different from what happens at the national level? So one of the other things that is critical that I took note of earlier was that state policies have a significant impact on who votes. Now, it doesn't, it's a complex story in that it is not that voter ID requirements, for example, are the causal factor of massive declines in voter participation, because they are not. But are they having an effect on the margins? Yes. Are they impacting the results of elections? Yes. But it is hard to say in the political science literature that voter ID requirements, for example, are the driver of a decline. But we do know that they have an impact. We know that the efforts of felony convictions and disenfranchising people because of their felony convictions has had a significant impact, and that is one of the things that is changing in Florida. But even though in a referendum voting, overwhelming numbers of Floridians voted to essentially reinstate the voting rights of those who had previously served felony convictions, it remains a charged political topic that it remains going through the legislature and through the courts. We know that wealth continues to have an impact on who votes, and citizenship status, and then disability status. I'm just blanking. The General Accounting Office, in a study of polling locations, found that fully a third of polling locations in the United States were not accessible to people with disabilities. So despite someone perhaps going to try and vote, if they are not able to, in fact, get to the polling location and actually vote, then their rights have been taken away from them, and perhaps significantly discouraged from attempting to vote in later elections. We've already touched on the personal characteristics and on state policies. So have same-day registration, and that is a policy that absolutely engages people, in part, and promotes turnout, and in fact has higher rates of turnouts in the states that have it. In part, the reason behind that is because for people who are already engaged in politics, they know when elections are coming up, they pay attention to the electoral calendar, and they probably know a lot about the candidates, even for a significant amount of time. For people who are not following politics, who are not engaged, their point of contact from a campaign generally does not occur until the last 2 weeks prior to there actually being an election. This is shifting somewhat because of early voting. But the bottom line is that the excitement level, the engagement, the knowledge that election is even taking place is not something that people really know about at all until those last 2 weeks. And if the voter registration line happens to occur 20 days before the election, not that critical 14, then anybody who thinks that they want to vote now that they've had that contact and been excited can't do it. And that in and of itself is discouraging to them. Automatic voter registration is a policy that is also occurring in many states right now. And this is the kind of thinking about psychology that it's better to have people essentially be registered to vote and then opt out, rather than the other way around, that you have to opt in. And the thinking there is that it will encourage people to be registered to vote. The challenge with that is there are a few of them, but one of them is that when we move, we have to change our registration status, and sometimes that is tricky with this. Early voting is a policy that has also taken hold in the last 20 years. Not every state has it, but many have adopted it. It has become a political hot potato in some states where they expanded it and then they retracted it. But early voting is the idea that in the 2 weeks prior to an election, or maybe the 3 weeks even, there can be some voting that occurs prior to election day to encourage convenience and to try to reduce long lines. That doesn't always happen, but it is an effort to try to improve that. When an election is held, does have a massive impact on turnout. So in years that are odd years, when a lot of municipal elections take place, those are years that people do not vote. They don't vote because they don't know about elections. And if you ask them, is there an election coming up? In even numbered years, people are far more likely to know that there's an election coming up. Why? Because the campaigns that are running for Congress, for president, for the Senate are all spending a lot of money to make sure that people know that there's an election. But municipal elections simply do not have that kind of funding. And the other piece of it is many municipal elections are non-party elections. That means that that critical cue of knowing whether somebody is a Democrat or a Republican and therefore who to vote for, so you don't really have to learn about the candidate as long as you know what party you're part of. If you don't have that in a municipal election, then it requires a lot more work on your part to try to know what's happening. And that means that, and that can be discouraging as well as very hard to find information. And in a time when we have lost all of these wonderful local newspapers, locating information is even in its time of information overload, locating high quality information about candidates in a municipal election is tough. I've already talked about felon disenfranchisement and voter ID requirements. And then the other thing is this issue of how the psychology of a political campaign. And that's also super important to understand. Political campaigns, one thing we know about them, no matter what their budget, no matter what, they are short on two things, which is time and money. And because they're short on those, their entire incentive structure is to go after those voters who they know will reliably vote for them. And so they're going to go after the people who are over 60 years old because they are reliable voters. They are going to go after the people who they know they can get funding from, who happen to have more money. They know that it is going to be a waste of their time to try to go after the voters who may or may not vote. And that creates a virtuous cycle for the people who are being contacted and getting engaged and therefore getting reminded and feeling important. And it creates a completely vicious and discouraging cycle for those people who are not getting contacted, not being encouraged, and therefore not being made to feel important and part of the political process. So the entire incentive structure is to persuade those registered voters and to connect with people who can provide those critical funds for those elections to exist. I'm going to end there and stop my screen share for a moment so that I can see all of you, and open it up for questions. And you can feel free to just use your audio or your video.
I did turn everybody's videos off during the presentation, so please feel free to turn them back on, or I can do it for you because during the recording, it's kind of, you don't want to be in the recording. So I have a question for you while people do that and think about what their questions would be. I noticed that you didn't, or maybe I missed it, talk about gerrymandering, which is a word that comes up so often, and I don't actually know what it means. And I actually would be interested in your definition of it, as well as how it affects turnout.
Okay, great question. So let me begin, before I talk about gerrymandering, with talking about districting, and just a refresher. The United States Constitution tells us that every 10 years, I don't know, we are in the 2020 census cycle right now, but every 10 years we have to count up everybody. And then after counting all of them, we have to figure out, all right, how many seats do we have in the House of Representatives, or whatever legislature we're dealing with that is based on population. And then we have to figure out sort of where people have moved and how things have changed in those 10 years, and redraw the district lines based on that total population. So in the last cycle, the district size went up to being about 700,000 people. Does that make sense? I hope so. So every congressional district in the United States is about 700,000 people. Massachusetts lost population in 2010. Texas gained population. So it meant that Massachusetts ultimately had to lose a congressional seat, and Texas gained, I think, 3, but I'm not entirely sure. So we have to create those districts to accommodate those populations so that we have a representative per district across the United States. So that's a perfectly right thing to do. We are required to district. If we district in a way that it manipulates things such that we put all of the white voters into one district and all of the black voters into another district, which we may want to do actually because we want to create more minority representation. But if we did that actually to dilute minority power, or if we decided to create a super safe district for one representative and a super not safe district for another representative, then we have much more pernicious motives. And that means that we are hurting the political process. So what has happened so gerrymandering is essentially the manipulation of districts for political ends, rather than the creation of a district that has some sort of balance to it that makes sense to the communities that are being represented. But it's obviously really complex because what needs you have and what needs I have and what we want in a representative may be super different. And so how do we balance all of those needs when we're creating a district is not straightforward. But what we do know, and then we get into a little bit more math, is that when gerrymandering goes really, or I guess for people who want it that way, but when it goes really too far, what we have done is mathematically found a way to reduce the representation of one party, even though they have more people in that particular party. So Wisconsin is an example of where that happened. There were a lot of Democrats in Wisconsin, and yet the Republicans managed to find a way to have far more seats in the state legislature than they really had in the number of people that they were representing. And likewise, the same thing happened in Maryland, but in the reverse, so that the Democrats managed to have a lot more seats, even though there were a lot of Republicans. So gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has said that they don't really want to deal with it parties, but that's what's happening. We're creating a lot of super safe districts for political parties that makes it virtually impossible for someone of the opposite party to win in that district. Now, as I said, this is complex, and another tricky piece to this is when you have really competitive districts, sort of theoretically, we think, okay, if you have really competitive districts, then you're going to get people who are going to be more moderate because they're going to be trying to gain that, that sort of middle of the road voter on the Republican side and on the Democratic side. The thing is that there are some districts, and probably some of us live in those districts ourselves, where there really is a high number of a particular kind of political vision and ideology. And people who live in super safe districts where they feel like their representative is kind of that super liberal or maybe super conservative is actually truly representing their views on things. And so if you tried to create a competitive district on it, they would not get the same kind of representative that they actually wanted, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Wow, I feel so much more educated. I know you're paying attention to the chat, but there was a question a little bit further back from Myra who says, what impact does mail-in ballot option have?
Yeah. So I am just getting myself back into this literature. You know, if you had asked me last year what impact it had, I would say that in the states that have fully mail-in ballot, there was some preliminary evidence when they moved to full vote by mail that it actually exacerbated some existing inequalities, and that people who take advantage of so-called convenience voting methods, such as vote by mail, early voting, etc., were people who were already predisposed to be involved in the political system anyway, and so it sort of had this negative impact on people who didn't. But that seems to have disappeared. And I am hearing more and more from political scientists who have studied this, that they think that mail ballots are the absolute way to go forever for precisely many of the reasons of encouraging more turnout. There are issues with it, but those issues, you know, in any policy area, there are going to be issues, and we want to pay attention to those issues, and we want to mitigate challenges that we have with them. But at the end of the day, should mail-in ballots be the way to go in this upcoming election? Absolutely. It has not hurt people in Washington, Utah, or Colorado, and California has a version of it. So it's a good thing. Okay. Is the declining voting correlated with discouragement in the power of individual votes, gerrymandering, voter suppression? Well, so this is a complicated question, because when we say the decline in voting, then I have to say, well, what election? Are we talking about presidential elections, midterm elections? We saw a huge increase in midterm participation in the 2018 midterms. We see some decline in municipal elections, but in municipal elections, there simply is not the focus. Well, first of all, they're not really impacted at the same level as about gerrymandering that we're seeing in state and federal elections. And voter suppression. So all of these methods that discourage voters and especially in the case of voter suppression are so terrible. It's hard to say that they are, you know, there's no single cause of all of this. But one of the things that I would say that the sort of is the hyperness of all of this has happened, the hyperness of our elections, the hyper focus on voter ID and the changes that have happened in states that happen now with increased speed, is that it is making it's sort of dizzyingly confusing for people. And we've changed policies so much that in and of itself, it's like, you know, so many policy changes. How do I know whether I can vote? And is it worth it? At the end of the day, is it really going to change anything? And I think in the case of a district that is significantly gerrymandered, it is discouraging. But we don't have, or at least I am not aware of, hard evidence in political science that says, yeah, that nobody's voting in those gerrymandered districts. It's, as I said, it's happening at the margins, but not in a way that we think is necessarily so huge that we can say, look at it, 60% change. All right. Why don't candidates want to broaden their base by helping unregistered voters to vote? So sometimes candidates do broaden their base, and that's one of the things that Ayanna Pressley did. She went in and decided, I am going to go after unregistered voters and people who have felt discouraged from the political process. But why did she do that? because she was going up against an incumbent who had no incentive, actually, to go after the people who weren't going to, he didn't know were going to vote for him. Politicians, if they want anything, they want to know exactly who their core is. They want to know exactly who to go after. And they don't want that to change much because that's what got them elected in the first place. So their incentive is to keep everything about as stable as possible so that they can win, because they're in it to win it. So the incentive structure of having our politicians run our elections, i.e. having them be the secretaries of state, having them do all of the districting, is a problem of massive proportions, because it is precisely they who have every incentive in the world not to want to change much of anything. Okay, what are your views on the Electoral College versus the popular vote? I was just saying there's a new book out about the Electoral College that I am going to read when it comes out on July 30th. And so I'll know a heck of a lot more July 31st than I do right now. But I think the Electoral College, so this is my personal view, I think it is a relic of a particular debate at a particular time that is not serving this country particularly well. My concerns about the Electoral College are also my concerns about the United States Senate. The United States Senate is the most mal-apportioned legislature in the world. So that means that it is a legislature that, in the case of Wyoming, has 2 senators for 500,000 people, and in the case of California, has 2 senators for 30 million people. And so the kind of essentially vote dilution that Californians receive under that paradigm is so great and so hurts them and so helps Wyoming that the power imbalance is just enormous. And so I think that's the same for the Electoral College. It is giving far more power to low population places and just diluting the voice, the political voice of those who are living in more populated areas. You know, but changing this is difficult, and there are lots of very good reasons that I think that people have expressed for wanting to keep the Electoral College. So I think this kind of change, we always have to, be careful what we wish for in changing things. But when I think about it, and I think about it as a matter of who has political voice and the lack of equality, essentially, in political voice under this one, I think that's the one I'm more concerned about. Are there other systems where the equivalent of secretaries of state are not politicians? Yes. There are, in fact, in every other advanced democracy. So I'm assuming that this is a comparative democracy question about democracies around the world. So basing it on that, then every other advanced democracy has basically an independent commission that is running elections rather than having it be politicians running elections, essentially having the foxes guarding the hen house. And that means that elections are simply not politicized, or the election administration, rather, is not politicized in other countries the way it is in the United States. But there's I think, and I say good in quotes, right, good reason for the United States to have had the system that it's had, because it serves those in power.
I have another question. This is Mina, and it's about why people don't vote, why people choose not to vote. That's been hitting me a lot lately, especially when we know that because of there's been 2 elections in the last 20 years where the person in power, who won, didn't win the popular vote. So that's the electoral thing. But in the last election, we heard of so many people that did not vote, and on every level, there's so many people that do not vote. So like if you get a 30% turnout, people are like, whoa, that's so great. So my question to you is, why do people choose to not vote?
There are a lot of reasons for that. Some cases, so one thing I want to be really clear on is I think for people who vote, let's say, once you have voted, you are on the list, the registered voter list. Campaigns are contacting you. People are contacting you. You are feeling wanted. You are feeling connected, and you are feeling powerful as a result. I mean, I know that for those of us who get like a gazillion things from politicians, we're like, I don't want to be wanted, and I get that. But we are part of a political community for those of us who are voting and feel that. So for people who are not contacted, I'm not sure that there is even that sense of choice here, because it is such a discouraging experience often, to not feel connected. So overall, right, people who don't vote so when I ask my students, why don't you vote? They say, I don't know enough. I just don't know enough. Now, of course, we want to say, well, you got to go learn. As I keep saying to everybody, the older my kids get and the closer to 18 they get, the more I realize, wow, we're really expecting a lot for them to be able to go get that information, make sense of it, and understand it. Obviously, the other thing that we're not doing in our schools is civics. And we're not doing it, we should be doing it at age 4, teaching people basic democratic principles and helping them through that system so that by the time they get to age 18, they are ready, or maybe 16 if we lower the voting age, but whatever age it is, welcoming them into the world of being a full citizen, with power to be able to make sense of the information that's thrown at them and know how to navigate that information and know where to find it. When I ask my students in a civics class to go to the Secretary of State's website and figure out whether they're registered to vote, that is not easy. You can look at a lot of Secretaries of State websites around the country and rank them yourselves for ease of understanding. I mean, I myself, as a political scientist who studies elections, have a tough time finding information and remembering, what is it, that website that they told me was a bad one versus the one that was a good one, and where am I supposed to do this, and all of these questions that I'm having trouble with, and this is what I think about every single day. So if all of this is new to you, to even know what the terms being registered to vote means, it's very confusing and dizzying. So I think that we know that the reasons that people don't vote, the mobilization story, I have to say, I think is the biggest one. That once people are pulled in and they are connected, it is very hard to lose them from. But if they are not pulled in, then they're not part of it. So that's number one. Number two is a knowledge issue, but knowledge. And then number three is that sense of alienation and also just fatigue of having had it with a system that people feel is stacked against them, and that's highly discouraging. But despite that, look at the kind of mobilization that happened in the 2018 midterm election and the huge increase in voting that happened across all demographic groups and across all age groups. So when the time comes, you can pull people in, but it is not easy.
It definitely seems it. Does anybody else have any questions? Because we have about 10 more minutes. I do have a question that is related to that, in that I've seen a lot of people like in a place like Lexington, trying to help out in other states where they feel like there's not as much engagement. Is that something that is helpful? Or maybe we're just, I don't know, is that a good use of our time to help other states?
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very beginning. So in a place that's already ostensibly fine, is it a good thing to go to other states?
Right.
Is that kind of the question? So the only reason I laugh is because I was hearing the complaints yesterday of, I can't remember where, of people saying, yeah, I guess it was, I was listening to some people who were very concerned about kind of the state of political parties, saying that, you just bring in these busloads of people from other states who don't know what's going on the ground, and it's highly problematic. So I think all hands on deck in a time of presidential elections. And so if there's a cause you believe in, and there's a place that seems to be going the way you want it to go, it does make sense to engage in other states. That being said, it also makes a huge amount of sense for anybody who's engaged in politics to spend a lot of time listening and on the ground really paying attention to the real, genuine concerns and needs of people. And I think that is one place where the political parties have erred, is that they are spending a lot of money on advertising and not as much money necessarily listening to the needs of voters.
Mm-hmm. So Janet has a question. I don't know if you had seen it.
Sorry, I'm suggesting to somebody in the room the typing stop. Do I think that mail-in voting will increase turnout? All right, so I pause because I'm very worried about this upcoming election. I think that it will, so I don't actually know where I think all of this is headed. My worry is about, my worry is everything from how do we safely vote? And I do think that mail-in is the way to go. But I also think that the way that states are approaching it, once again, no surprise, right? Every state is doing it differently. There's going to be huge misinformation, huge amount of complexity to all of it. And what I'm, and then a lot of steps to be able to do, we're not in Massachusetts. I don't believe we're just going to get the ballot in the mail. We have to request the ballot. So we have to go through this two-step process to request the ballot, get the ballot, mail it. How many pieces of envelopes are we going to have to put all of this in to get our ballot back? We're not going to have the drop boxes that states that have all mail voting have. The states that have had all mail voting have been doing it for 20 years. Know exactly how to do it. They make improvements on it every year. This is going to be something that policymakers are throwing together in 5 weeks, which to do. I am not. Okay, hold on. I'll be right there. Sorry.
You not own this room?
So throwing it together in 5 weeks, and I think there's just going to be a lot of things that are going to go wrong. The other thing that I'm worried about is just that the way that we're going to be able to count the ballots once we get them, we're not necessarily investing in the high-speed scanners that we need. This is a lot of additional work for our poll workers, and I think a lot of our poll workers are going to decline being poll workers for health concerns. So now I'm a part of an effort to try to mobilize a whole new group of young people to be poll workers. But here I have talked with you about the low levels of voting among our young people. And if they are the only ones at the polling locations administering elections who have never voted in their lives, right? The areas for error are great. And I say this with all of the love in the world for our young people, but they need to have the mentorship of the people who've been through it to help guide them, just as we want people to mentor anybody on any new job that they're part of. So I think the challenges are very massive. This is good. I just read that in Bedford, everyone will be mailed the application for the ballot, automatically mailed the application, but not the ballot. And so that's the step. We're going to have the application, but we don't just get the ballot and fill it out. And in some states, they're just going to get the ballot. And I think that's going to be confusing. I think not everybody will understand even what the application means, and should they fill out the application, and who's going to look at it. Even the terminology that we use for our poll workers with our young people, I say, please try to be a poll worker. And then they apply and they think they're going to get something in the mail that says, congratulations, we've accepted your application. So even this terminology is difficult and confusing for people.
That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, if we don't have any more questions, which it doesn't look like we do, I want to say thank you so much, Rachel. This has been fascinating. I so appreciate your time and your thinking on these topics that are on our minds.
Thank you, and thank you for managing a few interruptions from members of my household.
I told my son to not come upstairs for the next hour, so I'm with you. So I just wanted to tell the people here that we have a program every week all through mid-August on voting. So please check our calendar for the next one, which is next Monday. It's on political hobbyism. And we're really excited about that. But before, I just wanted to say thank you again, Rachel. Thank you everybody for coming and for your wonderful questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.